There's something men rarely manage to see in the moment it's happening. They only realize it later, when silence has already taken over the spaces that used to be filled by her. When messages take longer to be answered, when the smile disappears without any apparent explanation, when you start to feel like you're fighting against a tide that you yourself don't even know when it began. And then comes the question that hurts. What happened? Because you can't identify a specific moment, a fight that destroyed everything, a betrayal, a serious mistake. It feels like things slowly faded, like a flame that didn't go out all at once. It just dried up. And most of the content about this topic will give you a list of behaviors to change. It will tell you that you became too available, that you stopped creating mystery, that you stopped being challenging. But that's shallow. That's the surface of something much deeper. And that's exactly why a lot of people follow the advice, change their behavior for a while, and nothing really changes, because behavior without substance is performance. And she notices the difference. What happened in most cases has nothing to do with what you did or didn't do in isolation. It has to do with who you were becoming or stopping being over time. And that process is silent, gradual, and almost invisible to the person who's inside it. There's a pattern that shows up often in relationships that start well and then cool off. In the beginning, the man is in motion. He has projects, he has presence, he has something going on in his life that naturally generates attraction. Not because he tried to be attractive, but because he was being himself, in motion, with purpose. And then the relationship starts, grows, becomes the center, and little by little, without noticing, he starts transferring all the emotional weight of his identity onto that relationship. What used to be a man with his own life who invited her in becomes a man whose life now revolves around her. And there's no blame here. It's an almost natural process when you're in love. The problem is what happens next, when the relationship becomes the only place where he seeks approval, confirmation of value, meaning, when her response defines whether it was a good day or a bad day, when he needs her mood to feel okay, when insecurity starts to show up in small questions disguised as affection, in jealousy that tries to look like love, in a constant need for reassurance. She doesn't lose interest because you were kind. She loses interest because at some point you stopped being a whole man and started being a man who needs her to feel whole. And that changes everything. Not because she's cruel, but because genuine attraction doesn't sustain itself in dynamics of emotional dependence. No one can respect and desire at the same time someone who has transferred all emotional responsibility for himself onto the other person. And there's another level to this that's talked about even less. When a man loses his own center inside a relationship, he starts acting from fear instead of acting from values. He stops saying what he thinks clearly because he's afraid of creating conflict. He agrees with things he doesn't agree with because he needs peace at any cost. He stops setting boundaries because setting boundaries feels risky. And every time he does that, he lays a small brick in the wall between them, not her, him. Because when you erase yourself to please someone, the person on the other side loses the reference of who you are. And without that reference, there's no way to create real connection. Real connection doesn't happen between a whole person and a shadow. She needs someone to actually relate to, not a mirror that reflects back what she wants to see. Now, there's also a very common misdiagnosis here. The man feels her pulling away and interprets it as a problem to be solved. So he starts doing more, trying more, compensating more messages, more gestures, more attempts to win back attention. And the more he does this from a place of anxiety, the more he confirms exactly the dynamic that created the problem. Because she's not pulling away from a man who does too little. She's pulling away from a man who has lost himself. And doing more things from the same place doesn't fix it. It only deepens it. The turning point, when it happens, doesn't come from strategy. It doesn't come from a decision to change behavior. It comes from a much more honest and much more difficult internal change, which is recognizing that at some point you gave up your own direction. And the question that demands isn't, what do I need to do to make her want me again? The honest question is, what did I let die in me during this relationship? Which projects did I abandon? Which parts of myself did I move away from? In which moments did I stop telling the truth because I was afraid of her reaction? I'm not talking about guilt. I'm talking about responsibility. And there's a huge difference between the two. Guilt paralyzes. Responsibility moves you. The process of becoming a more whole man isn't about becoming more interesting to her. It's about building an honest relationship with yourself, about being clear on what you want, what you tolerate, what's non-negotiable for you, about developing the ability to be emotionally present without being swallowed by emotions, about learning to deal with conflict without running away and without exploding, about speaking clearly even when the conversation is uncomfortable, about having your own life not as a seduction strategy, but because having your own life is what an emotionally healthy adult has. And here's the point that separates this content from any "how to win her back in 7 steps" advice. When you go through this process honestly, the result with her is unpredictable. She may notice the real change, and that may reignite something. She may have already moved on emotionally, and that window may have closed. She may be in a place that's independent of what you do. And both possibilities are valid, because you don't have control over her choices. You only have control over who you decide to be. And that's the truth few people want to hear. Inner work is not a guarantee of external results, but it's the only thing that has real value in the long run. Because a man who works on himself as a conquest strategy will abandon that work as soon as he doesn't need it anymore. And a man who works on himself because he understood that this is the most honest way to exist in the world, that guy carries something different. And that shows up naturally in how he carries himself, how he speaks, how he occupies space. There's also something about how female interest works that needs to be said clearly, without romanticizing and without sexism. When a woman loses interest, it's usually not an event, it's a process. And a process has layers. There's the layer of what she consciously feels. There's the layer of what she observes in behavior. And there's a deeper layer, which is how she feels being herself when she's around you. And that last layer is where things usually get decided. If being around you makes her feel seen, respected, free to be herself without having to walk on eggshells, that creates something that lasts. If being around you creates a kind of emotional tension of having to monitor your state, of having to emotionally refill you all the time, of feeling that any movement will generate an emotional reaction, that's exhausting. And accumulated emotional exhaustion is one of the most silent and most definitive forms of erosion of interest. That doesn't mean she can't support you, that you can't have moments of vulnerability, that the relationship has to always be light. Real relationships have weight. But there's a difference between a man who can be vulnerable because he has emotional structure and a man who transfers the responsibility of regulating his own emotions to his partner. One thing is intimacy, the other is dependence. And finally, something that rarely shows up in these conversations, the pattern you carry from previous relationships, from your history, from the way you learned or didn't learn to deal with rejection, with abandonment, with closeness. That pattern repeats itself. Not because you're weak or because you're stuck, but because patterns don't change by willpower. They change through awareness, through repeated exposure to new ways of acting, through consistent choice over time. And that is work. Real work. Slow, sometimes frustrating, and completely necessary. When you look back and try to understand what happened, the most honest answer is rarely in a specific moment. It's in the accumulation of who you were becoming. And the good news, if there is one, is that you can start being different now. Not necessarily for her, but for yourself. And that distinction makes all the difference. If you made it this far, you're already different from most. Most people close the video when the truth starts to get uncomfortable. So let me ask you a question before you go. What was the moment when you realized you were acting from fear and not from who you really are? Write it in the comments. It doesn't have to be long. One sentence is enough. Because sometimes naming this out loud, even if it's in a YouTube comment, is the first real move someone makes after a long time standing still. And if this video made sense to you, send it to someone who needs to hear this. Not as advice, as a gesture. See you in the next one.